started. Thank you today for taking time out of your day to join us. Today's webinar is a joint presentation with website accessibility experts, Siteimprove. Just a quick intro to the SilverTech team here. I'm your host, Ian Hughes. I'm the marketing manager here at SilverTech. Throughout today's presentation, I'll be manning the chat pane to gather any questions you may have. And I'll also be following up with everyone after the presentation with access to the recording. I'm joined by SilverTech's Director of Solution Architecture, Andrew Eddy. In this role, Andrew uses a strategic combination of engaging web experiences, marketing automation, and customer relationship management solutions to facilitate business processes and customer engagement. Andrew is our in-house website accessibility expert and will be on hand to answer any questions that come along the way. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks for joining, everyone.
And we're thrilled today to be joined by Corb O'Connor, Accessibility Testing Operations Manager at Siteimprove. For those of you who are not yet familiar, Siteimprove offers the world's most comprehensive cloud-based digital presence optimization, DPO software, and the Siteimprove Intelligence Platform provides eye-opening insights that empower more than 7,000 teams to create higher quality content, drive better traffic, manage digital performance, and work towards regulatory compliance, all from one place. Siteimprove also offers best-in-class technical support, academy courses, services, and technology integrations. So without further ado, I'll pass the presentation over to Corb and let him fully introduce himself and walk us through. He has, folks, for us an excellent and thorough presentation on what's new in WCAG 2.1. Remember, if you have any questions or comments along the way, please post them in the webinar chat pane. Andrew and I will be on hand to answer, and we'll reconvene as a group at the end for any Q&A. Over to you, Corb.
Excellent. Well, thanks. Good afternoon to everybody here. And if I can make sure that I'm sharing the right screen here, let me make that happen. There we go.
There it is.
All right, very good. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So Corb O'Connor, I previously, before working at Siteimprove, I oversaw accessibility drive at a financial institution here in the US, and really took their organization from thinking that accessibility was something we needed to do and we had to do to something that was an exciting thing to be doing, and really got the organization moving in the direction of making sure that everybody understood why we were doing this, who we were serving, and how we were going to get to an accessible presence. So today, what I want to start with is, for some of you, real briefly, want to go over the what is this WCAG that we're talking about? What is the World Wide Web Consortium? We won't spend too long on that because we really want to dive into this new, as of June of this year, guidelines that came out. We're all familiar with 2.0, and now we've moved to 2.1. And then really talking about how do we make sure that that's something, what's the impact of that on the Americans with Disabilities Act and our compliance with that, and then how do we start implementing WCAG 2.1. And finally, for those who are interested, go over briefly go over what Siteimprove is all about and how we've been a shaping force of the web content accessibility guidelines. But let me start first by talking about how web content accessibility guidelines are just a start. This is, when we talk about accessibility, a lot of times we're looking for a very specific standard for accessibility. And so that standard exists. It's an international set of guidelines, but it's really not a project. So many times we say, okay, let's take on this project to make our site accessible. But when we think about it, a project really is a very narrow scope. And a project is a temporary endeavor. Accessibility is not temporary. Accessibility is something that we're going to continue to be doing. A project is something that's undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. You create unique products and services and results every day, and we want all of those, and you want all of those to be accessible. And so really, accessibility then is about being a process. It's everybody coming together and around an initiative and requiring everybody to bring unique contributions together. Now, that said, you're still going to be having a subject matter expert involved in accessibility. You're going to have every role that's going to be part of accessibility is going to be uniquely engaged. So as we look at the different roles that are involved in accessibility, I want you to take a moment and figure out, where do you fall in this list, and maybe where does your boss fall, or your closest colleague fall, that you're going to need their help on this initiative. So everybody has a unique role, right? Leadership's role is going to be different than procurement, is going to be different than a developer role, but we're all going to be involved in accessibility. Again, we're going to need to rely on subject matter expertise. We're going to need to rely on specialized tools, specialized software, but we're all going to be involved in this process. But today, I want you to let your imagination run wild. And that is to say that today, the creativity in your implementation plan is going to be a lot more important than taking down the details of all the different guidelines that we're going to talk through. And I say that because so many times you come away from these meetings and you have these detailed notes, but you miss the chance to really disconnect from email and Skype and Slack and say, how do we build an implementation plan around accessibility, especially around these new guidelines? That means today that creativity is going to be more important than the details. I want to talk too about, so the WCAG 2.1 guidelines that were released earlier this year, they expanded on what was released in 2008. So if you think about it, when those guidelines came out in 2008, the iPhone had just been released a little bit before that. The iPad had come out a few years later. And so the iPad and iPhone really weren't a thought as the bulk of these guidelines were being written. And so we needed now to step back and say, let's make sure that the new guidelines, these WCAG 2.1, the internet has changed in 10 years. Let's make sure that we're adding on to the existing guidelines. We're not replacing them, but we're adding on to them. And let's make sure that the orientation of an iPhone is going to be very different for some users with disabilities than others. And that's going to have an impact on the accessibility of a website. Also, we're going to have users with limited or different cognitive impairments. So these might be users with dyslexia or learning disabilities. These might be people who really need some assistance when it comes to identifying the purpose of input fields across the web. And finally, users with low vision. Myself included, a lot of the guidelines that have been out for years when it comes to accessibility, and when we talk accessibility in general, a lot of the guidelines around building access have to do with people who use a wheelchair or are blind. But what about users who are blind but maybe still have some residual vision? How do we make sure that their experience on a website is just as inclusive as another's? So, by the way, happy birthday to WCAG. It's turned 10 just a few days ago. And so that said, these guidelines aren't new, but sometimes for your organization, these guidelines are new. And so we want to take a moment and as an organization, you can be part of celebrating the guidelines being out and having a rich standard to rely upon. For all the question marks that accessibility has, we have this great standard that's been out there. And so many times when it comes to the web content accessibility guidelines, we want to try to take this document and structure it in a way that makes sense for us and for our organizations. But I had a colleague ask me once, she said, why are you reorganizing the web content accessibility guidelines? They already make a lot of sense. The web content accessibility guidelines are organized into 4 key principles that we're going to touch on in just a moment. And that's the idea of how their main structure is. Beneath those, we've got guidelines that are very, still pretty broad to talk about how should we make sure that these principles that we have, how do we really implement those? And then we have success criteria under those. Those success criteria really dig into the details. And best of all, we have some great techniques that are out there. Now, don't jump to the failures. We also have some great techniques from the W3C that give us some advice on how to move forward. But today, we're going to focus on these top 3. These are really what have changed recently. And this is really what can have an impact when it comes to how your organization and your institution can become more accessible and more inclusive. So let's take a moment, for some of you who may be new to accessibility, And what does it mean? These are the 4 principles of accessibility: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So the idea of perceivable is that this content is able to be understood by users in multiple different ways. So we, for example, have this is a basic form on the screen with a name that's been left blank in the input field. There's an error message, an email address that's been partially completed, and an error that we have displayed. And you'll see that it's very easy for you to see these. It passes color contrast. It's very understandable what's going on just looking at this. Operable means that a user who's maybe navigating without a mouse is able to reach these different components. So you can't really see that on the screen here, but if these were native input fields, right, a user who's using a keyboard, that might be a screen reader user, it might be somebody with a limited mobility, is able to reach those different form fields. That it's understandable. So somebody who maybe has a cognitive impairment or a traumatic brain injury, imagine what would happen if they had written part of their email address like this, but we didn't have a label above it that said email address. And they might wonder, what was this box for again? Was that for my name? Was that my phone number? And this really, as much as we use that as an example, I've seen this happen in real life. Somebody will start typing their email address. They'll think, oh, wait, maybe that was for my name. They'll try and submit the form, and the form will just highlight that field in red without any explanation of what's going on. And it can be very jarring and confusing to users. And sure, they could delete what's in that field, but imagine that took you some time to enter that text because maybe you're not a touch typist because you only have 1 or 2 fingers that you can use with enough dexterity to type. So that's really what understandable is. And finally, robust. That this code on this form, for example, is written in a way that somebody with different technology, different screen reader, maybe they're using some different software, maybe they're using a different device, that form is going to work well for them, and those error messages are going to be understandable for them in multiple different ways. So that's really, when we talk about the 4 principles of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, that's what we're looking at. But today, let's look at these new level A and AA success criteria within the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that have changed most recently and that are most likely to be something that raise more questions than answers. And we're going to start with this guideline of adaptable. This is where some of the changes come in. So this is about making sure that info and relationships are clear, that the sequence of items on your page is understandable, that we're not using sensory characteristics is what WCAG calls them. So maybe saying, hey, the items in red are required. Well, what if you can't see red? So the first new success criterion has to do with orientation. Now, this may seem pretty straightforward to those of you who are using a website on a mobile device. I've got pictured here a tablet and 2 orientations, portrait and landscape. And the idea being that let's make sure that if somebody has their phone fixed in a certain orientation, maybe it's fixed on their wheelchair, on a power wheelchair, maybe somebody who has low vision is holding it in an orientation that's best for them. For me, landscape is kind of tough for me it's a lot of scanning back and forth. I like to keep my phone in portrait mode. But that works well on a website. And generally, websites can make this orientation switch. But what about apps? My bank, for example, my couple of banks I use, require my phone to be in portrait mode. So under this success criterion, what we'd say is you want to make sure that app and that website are things that can be viewed in multiple orientations without losing any particular content. Now, there are exceptions, of course. So let's say you're developing a piano, and maybe not in your app, but just go with me on this. Here you have a piano application, right? Trying to fit that onto a portrait screen is going to be mighty tough. And so there are exceptions for all of these guidelines and all of these success criteria. But I think before we start talking about exceptions, let's make sure that we truly understand our users so that we're not looking at legal compliance, so that might be how we start. We really want to understand, how do we build a good experience? I remember a colleague told me, she said, you're talking to a user experience designer. None of us sit down and write a bad user experience at the beginning of the day on purpose. We want to have a good experience in our applications. And so as a result, let's make sure that we think about that as the driving force of accessibility. Here's another new one about understanding the input purpose. Now I'm going to put some code throughout this presentation, but I don't want you to be scared by it. This is for you to reference, and some of you who might be developers may have an understanding of this. Some of these really, though, are dealing with the underlying code of these experiences. So here's an example where generally, when we've coded a input field in the past, we haven't always put an autocomplete attribute. This is the part where if you're on your phone or your computer and you start typing your name and it knows, oh, you're typing your name. I bet I can help you. Or sometimes now even the iOS and Android devices, you can click a button and say, autofill as much of this form as you possibly can for me. So those operating systems make some suggestions. But really, having this autocomplete attribute will allow assistive technology to help users with disabilities to fill in those forms very clearly. So these are just, there's 50-some plus different attributes that you can use in this autocomplete field. Think about it as anything that you might type on a recurring basis. Your birthday, your telephone, your name, your address, the expiration year of your credit card even has an autocomplete attribute. So when you're a business line person and you see some of these code and we say it's really underlying the code, that's where you could reach out to your development teams and say, hey, as part of this project, we need to make sure we comply with WCAG 2.1. And specifically, under these forms, I want to make sure that we're identifying the input purpose. And you can give them a reference to the success criterion number of 1.3.5, and they can find it that way. So here we have an example of how these inputs can be helpful to a user. So this is what assistive technology might do for a form, other than helping somebody to fill it out by actually entering the data. Sometimes those autocomplete attributes can become icons. So in this case, their name became a person icon. The email has a little mail-looking icon. The website has what looks like a bookmark. So this way, the user with a cognitive disability, it may take them some time to read all the different labels on the form, but they can quickly see, oh, my assistive technology always puts a picture of a silhouette of a head, and I know that way that I need to make sure that that's where I put my name, or my email the same way. So let's move on to this guideline about WCAG being distinguishable. So remember, this is a big picture guideline, and this is about making sure that content is easier to hear and to see that content. So the first one, you're going to love if you're somebody who uses your phone on a regular basis and you visit a website and you have to pinch and zoom and pan around just to read the content. We've taken that for granted now, but you might remember just a few years ago, this was very much a frustration. So now we have some guidelines around making sure that different devices are going to have the content reflow so that it can be read by users in different ways. So this helps readability. This makes it easier for a low vision user not to have to scroll horizontally if they've increased the text size of their device. And of course, the exception is those things that require scrolling in 2 dimensions, like a map or a model, for example, that might necessitate being able to move multiple directions at once. Here's one that we talk a lot about, and that's contrast. We're used to looking at the contrast of text or of buttons, and now WCAG has extended that to say, let's make sure that even parts of graphics needed to understand content are also passing color contrast. So here's an example straight from the W3C. On the left, you'll see an information icon, and you'll notice it has 2 different colors. It's kind of a 2-tone behind it. So that I passes color contrast very easily at that dark blue in the bottom. But at the top, that light blue and white doesn't have enough contrast for somebody to be able to, with low vision maybe, to be able to identify what this icon is. And so what the guideline says is remove the parts of the graphic that don't pass contrast. Can you still understand the intent of that graphic without that part showing? So in this case, we've removed the lighter blue from the top, and we say, can somebody understand that? Now, maybe without that icon on the left, I think you'd have a really hard time saying that somebody's going to understand that this dropped line with a little curl at the end means the information symbol. So we'd want to look at a new design for this symbol. Maybe we'd want to adjust the colors. Maybe we don't need that 2-tone color behind it. Not saying we can't have color, just saying that we need to make sure that we have a high enough contrast ratio. Next guideline is about text spacing, and I won't go too far into the details of this, but suffice it to say that you, just as you don't have to set your text to the space on the website, we just want to make sure that somebody who wants to adjust the line spacing and the character spacing and the spacing between words, that they have the ability to do that. And this, we want them to be able to do it to this extent that you see on the right side with the extra space. Now, your website can certainly have text closer together, but when somebody hits it with assistive technology or with a custom style sheet in their browser and they want to change it, we need to make sure that that doesn't negatively impact their experience to the point that other content becomes unavailable to them or out of the way. And then we want to talk now, this is the part where it gets a little more difficult, is we talk about content on hover or focus. Now, you might think about this as you have a series of buttons in your navigation menu, and somebody goes to click goes to hover on them, and they get a tooltip that maybe tells them this is what option 2 is really about. And so when they're hovering on option number 2, you'll notice that tooltip, the word tooltip is covering up the next option on the list. This happened to me just a few days ago. I was shopping online, and I was zoomed into my computer. I was panning around trying to figure out what was going on, and all of a sudden, I found that I was zoomed in on top of a product image. Now, a lot of e-commerce sites do this, but I really didn't need to see a bottle of Tide or a bottle of Dawn dish soap at 600%, because remember, it was zoomed in for typical users, and then I had zoom applied on top of it. And while I was doing that, I couldn't get out of it to see the rest of the page. So instead, what we would be looking at is more like this option on the right. We want to make sure that when somebody zooms the text, that all the text of those buttons stays inside them, unlike the one on the left. We want to make sure as well that if there's a tooltip, it's something that you'll notice the user can, it's not blocking other content. The user can disable it by clicking the X without having to necessarily click off of the button. And they still have the option of reaching everything else on the page. So now we're moving on to the second portion, right? So we had these guidelines all fell under the perceivable category, and now we're moving into the guidelines about making sure that our site is easily operable. So we've talked about keyboard access for years. We want to make sure that users who can't use a mouse can navigate your site easily. And so here's the fun part, though. A lot of websites now are starting to realize that keyboard access is something that everybody wants. And so there's custom shortcuts built around that. If you're on Gmail, for example, and you want to navigate your inbox without using the mouse, that's very easy to do. You can navigate the entire experience, and you can, for example, maybe archive a message or move to the next message. So what I have here, I represented on the screen, are, imagine that you're somebody who's using Dragon Dictation as a software. So that means I can not only dictate text to my computer, but I can say things like, open Internet Explorer. Well, I would never do that. Open Google Chrome. Navigate to, Gmail. I log into Gmail with my username and password, and then I send, while I'm dictating to my computer, someone walks in my office and says, "Hi, Sean." Well, all of a sudden, I have starred a message, I've archived a message, I've marked another to trash, and I've moved to the next one because the computer picked all those keys up just from somebody saying, "Hi, Sean." So what we want to make sure is that users have the ability to turn off those single letter shortcuts on your page, that they can remap them. So they could maybe say, instead of, maybe I want to always be able to put the Alt key before my shortcuts on this site or in this app. And I want to make them active only when a component is in focus. So maybe I say, I only want to have keyboard shortcuts like this in these narrow instances when I may be already have focused on my inbox in Gmail, using that example. And now we move on to the different ways, the input modalities. Sounds fancy, really not that complex. This is really just about making sure that people who use the computer in different ways are able to navigate the site. This is actually a new, remember we talked about principles and guidelines? This is a new guideline. So we want to make sure that somebody who maybe is going to be navigating and operating a site using a device other than a keyboard or mouse has the opportunity to do that. So the first one are pointer gestures. So we call these multi-point or path-based gestures. If you're familiar with Android, we're going to show you an example in just a moment with pattern ID, where that's, maybe you can draw a pattern on the screen. This is going to really help users who lack the accuracy or pointing method doesn't provide. And you want to make sure that you have keyboard alternatives, but having that's not good enough. We want to make sure that people have a cognitive memory of keyboard shortcuts. Let's make sure we leverage that on a site. So here's an example of a pattern ID. So maybe this is, I'm showing a 4x4 grid on the screen, and just like I could use my fingerprint or my face or whatever biometric way we come up with next, you could draw a secret pattern on the screen. We want to make sure that this is something that somebody is able to do with different ways of accessing their phone other than tapping and dragging their finger around the screen. So let's examine this idea of drag and drop to understand what this pointer cancellation is all about. For those of you who are tech-minded, we're talking about making sure that we're only relying on up events and that those are abortable. Now, for the rest of you who are like me and took some time to understand this, let's talk about what this means. With your mouse, are you familiar with drag and drop? Right. So the first thing you do with your mouse when you want to drag and drop is you're going to point your mouse, then you're going to tap down on your keyboard or tap down on your mouse, sorry, to select that item. Then you're going to hold your mouse and while you're moving it across the screen, and then you're going to let up. So what this guideline says is let's only rely on that up event. If somebody points their mouse and taps down and drags across their screen and goes, oh wait, I don't want to do that, that they have a way to stop that action from happening. It happens a lot in apps. If you notice, sometimes if you're trying to scroll your transactions in a display, and every time you tap your finger down to start dragging from bottom to top to make that motion, it suddenly clicks. That's because that app is relying on that down trigger. It's saying, well, the user tapped this, they must want that. This guideline is saying, this success criterion is saying, no, we only want those actions to be taken when the user lets go of their mouse or lets up with their finger. This is a tricky one, but I think what you want to make sure is the bottom line for this is this. If you have an interaction when I tap something, if my finger is still there waiting, but the action has taken place, that's a problem for this criterion. I want to make sure that, yes, I tap something, but I have to let go before that action is taken. Okay, that's probably the most technical we're going to get this whole presentation. You made it. Well done. So here's an example of what not to do. If you're taking detailed notes, instead of really letting your mind run wild with me, let's hold up here. Don't write this one down. Very bad. Don't do this. But a lot of times we find there are instances on the web where you'll have a button. In this case, it's a button with an icon and the word help. And to try to make things a little bit clearer for our screen reader users, sometimes we'll provide a label that makes a little more sense. And so a well-intentioned developer says, help button doesn't really tell someone what this means. So they'll think, let's override it and change the button through an ARIA label, which is the equivalent of an alt tag on a button that says, get assistance. Okay, well, that's well-intentioned, but now you're a speech input user. So you're the one using Dragon saying, open Chrome, navigate to Gmail. Well, what happens when you then say, click button, help? Well, I can't do that because that button, that help button isn't there. The computer doesn't know what it is. It's been overridden with this get assistance label that I don't know is there. So instead, what I would tell you is in this code example, let's just make the button say help. It says help to the sighted person, it says help to a screen reader user, and it says help to a user with a cognitive impairment. And that's with a speech, navigating with speech. It also helps people with cognitive impairments because they're going to be able to better understand when they say, it's going to force us all to use better on-screen labels to explain what we really mean. So label in name, let's make sure they match. And now we come to the idea of this motion. If you're familiar with and maybe I'm teaching you some hacks about your iPhone in this session, but when you're using your iPhone and you've typed in some text and you want to undo that, what do? You shake your device. Okay, now what happens for the user who has their device mounted on their wheelchair, or they have tremors, and so they've disabled that motion because they might shake their phone frequently, but they don't mean to undo what they've typed. What do? In the case of the iPhone, I have not found a single solution to this. And so this would be a problem at the device level that you're not responsible for as an app developer, but something that you want to make sure, if we're going to rely on motion of any kind, let's make sure that the user can also operate this with a button or a control on the screen. So maybe in a check deposit situation, you're waiting for the user to turn their phone to be parallel with the ground so that then it's obvious that they're pointing their phone at a check. And that's one of the ways that we make sure that they're not able to scam our system. Well, that can be a real problem for somebody who is holding their phone in its particular orientation and using their other hands to hold the check now in front of the phone in a way that we weren't anticipating as designers. We want to make sure that if that option is there that says we're waiting for you to turn your phone, that they can say, I'm not going to do that, or I haven't done that, or I can't do that, so that we can still move them along in the flow. And now we're getting to the last set of guidelines, and that is the ones under robust. So this is about making sure that people with different types of technology can understand what's happening in a consistent way. So let's start with the idea of status messages. So we're familiar with status messages typically being errors, but this success criterion about status messages says that they can be programmatically determined through properties without receiving focus. Let me break that down for you. So I'm a screen reader user. I've typed in the word accessibility into the search engine. I've hit search. And maybe before I hit search, the screen is going to keep updating. And so if I type the letter A, it's going to say 50,000 results. I type C, and it'll say 30,000 results. And I type another C, right? And eventually we get down to 5 results. Before I move away from that input, text input, I want to make sure that the user has a chance, because sighted users have a chance to see that live updating content, that we make sure that that's programmatically available so that an assistive technology, as in not needing to use some kind of robotic expertise, it's just the technology itself can, and without needing to use any artificial intelligence, can pick up on that and really allow the user to see that. So now what allows me to do is, as I'm searching, I know I can stop typing for, if I've typed in diapers and I want to maybe find the right size for my 2-year-old, then I don't have to keep, I know that I've got a few enough results that I'm good to move down, and I don't need to keep typing to narrow the results and potentially narrow them too far in this situation. So those are the new guidelines and new success criteria. We got through them really quickly. There's so much more to each of these. And in a lot of cases, these are things that need to be tested by a human. They're not things that can be tested with automated technologies yet. There's some great work being done on that, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But I want you to think now about how is it that we're going to implement these changes. Some of you may have done that work already, and some of you, I'm just going to bring you back. At the end of the day, I want you to leave this webinar with the understanding of how am I going to make these changes at my organization regardless of my level. And for so many of us, that comes down to ADA compliance. So how is the ADA impacted by WCAG 2.1? In some ways, not at all. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, as many of you probably know, doesn't speak to the internet as a place of public accommodation directly, right? In 1990, when the law was signed by now late President Bush, that the internet didn't really exist in a form that was publicly available. And so what the Department of Justice over time has been asked, what about this accessibility? What do we do about the internet? What do we do about making sure it's accessible to people? And am I liable? And the short answer from the Department of Justice is that they first put out guidance that the ADA applies to public accommodations and websites over 20 years ago. This was released just this year, this statement. So additionally, they've said that the absence of a specific regulation, as in a specific government regulation, a specific piece of statute that applies the internet to the Americans with Disabilities Act does not mean that you can willy-nilly be non-compliant. So just because the government hasn't put out specific language that says that the internet is not covered by, that the internet is covered by the ADA, doesn't mean that it doesn't apply. But at the same time, here's what they also said. Accordingly, non-compliance with a voluntary technical standard, that's their way of saying the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, just by saying that somebody just saying your website doesn't meet WCAG 2.0 and therefore you're breaking the law. Department of Justice said, well, maybe not. Really, it's all about making sure that the user is truly impacted and harmed. The case law is very confusing, and I'm not a lawyer and this is not legal advice. But in a lot of cases, it's been left up to the courts to decide how does accessibility, the lack of accessibility regulations apply to the internet? And how does that apply to businesses like you? And really, at the end of the day, that's why I say let's not focus on the legal matters. Let's focus on the user's impact. Now, there's a blog that's about the Title III law, and Title III law.com. And the Title III blog talks about how, what is it about the ADA that's happening, right? So the ADA broken up into multiple titles. This is the one related to public accommodations. And here's what they wrote. And the Department of Justice was also asked by Congress, hey, we need some better language about this. And the Department of Justice basically put the ball back in the congressional court, and in Sayforth Shaw's opinion, where it's not likely to happen anytime soon. So really, when it comes to the accessibility and implementing that, we really want to talk about what are the rationales for acting, right? We've talked about the legal side. There certainly are legal ramifications for not making your website accessible and not making your app accessible. But at the same time, let's think about an aging population. It doesn't just mean that our eyes are not going to be working as well in the future, and maybe for some of us right now. But it also means that we're going to maybe have some limited mobility, and we're living longer, and we're expecting more of our financial institutions to be easy for us to do business with. And whether that's a walk-up kiosk, an iPad that's handed to me by my mortgage lender, or a website that I'm navigating to understand my options, I, as somebody who's aging, am going to be very interested in accessibility. And then we're also going to talk about how there's times that some people call these situational disabilities. And I think that changes the definition a little bit of what it is that a disability is. Right? We're not saying that a mom carrying a baby with her dominant arm suddenly has a disability because she's using her left hand. But you know what? My wife, who sometimes has to use her left hand because our toddler is in her right arm, is going to have to adapt the way that she works with her phone or works with her technology, and she won't have the dexterity that she's used to. And so new web content accessibility guidelines and success criteria about how do I make sure that I can use this experience are going to really help her, even if she's somebody who doesn't have a disability, because maybe it's an option where she doesn't have to worry about shaking her device or tilting her device a certain way, but she has a button or an option on her screen to make that happen. So as you make the case to your organization and to your colleagues, and as you personally think about this, I want you to think about the legal ramifications as just one of so many. I've just chosen 3 here, but of so many rationales for wanting to make your site more accessible. And so those rationales might include an aging population, people with low vision, people with cognitive disabilities, and maybe even all of us who are going to need a situational adaptation. And with that, I think we've got some time for some questions, and I want to hear from you about where is it what questions do you have about accessibility and implementing those changes that we've discussed so far today?
One question that comes to mind, where do you see accessibility going in 2019? We have WCAG 2.1 here. What's next?
What I'm seeing that, and what we're seeing here at Siteimprove is we're seeing a lot of organizations really committed to accessibility. And the starting point became, let's get an idea of where are we at right now. Let's get a baseline of accessibility. And I think the focus up to now has really been on making our experiences pass the letter of the law. And now it's really about thinking about how do we really expand that into a deeper understanding for everyone, and make sure that the users that we're thinking about are at the center of our design, such that we're not saying, let's build a second experience so that we won't get sued because we can always divert everybody over to the second experience and they'll be fine. But really saying, everybody is going to need to be a keyboard user at some point. Everybody is going to benefit when they have custom shortcut keys that they can turn off or on or remap. And so really it's going to be about continuing the education about awareness building for sure. But it's really going to be, I think, about taking all of that into consideration as we make new designs rather than necessarily needing to always think about retrofitting to make things good enough.
Excellent. Well said. Well said. My other question, Corb, is I think those on the line would love to hear, how can Siteimprove help?
Well, that's a question I'm more than happy to answer. So let me tell you a little about Siteimprove. Siteimprove helps organizations perfect their digital presence with eye-opening insights. So our tool will provide our dashboard. We crawl a website just like Google does. We go to a page and we start clicking links, and this is our automated tool. We'll do that for quality assurance. So we can check for broken links and misspellings. Like we can check for search engine optimization among certain checks. But we can also do that for accessibility. And so with one dashboard, you're able to see very clearly where are the accessibility issues on my site, how prominent are they, and what do I do about them. And then certainly the other parts of our platform are sort of an added bonus at that point. If we're scanning your site for accessibility, we're going to help you to find things where your brand might be misspelled, not technically misspelled, but maybe in a way that you wanted, your initials to always have periods between them, or you want your times and dates to be written a certain way. We can do that for you because we've already done that scan of your website. But more importantly, we can integrate into your existing environment. It's not another place you have to go check. So we have browser extensions. We can plug into your content management system. We can help you to build connections between our tool and yours through the Siteimprove API. We can really make some inroads for you so that accessibility is something that you always have a dashboard on, and so that you always have a place to go to prioritize your decisions. We've got customers around the world, happy customers around the world, and have checked over 50 million pages of the web. And so we really have a sense of not just the errors that we're seeing out there, but we're also having an opportunity to figure out what is it that, how is it that you can address those. So we'll link you straight into the guidelines that apply. We'll link you to the advisory techniques, and then you'll be able to quickly say, okay, I made this change, recrawl my site, did I fix it? And we'll be able to give you that insight. So really, everything we do is about making sure that we're providing that insight to you, that eye-opening insight to you on your digital presence.
Excellent. I think it's fascinating, Corb, that the Siteimprove platform also includes like SEO insights. Do you find that as you make accessibility fixes, they go hand in hand, that you do see SEO improvements? Does the tool kind of show you that?
Absolutely. One of my last organization, I remember I was proposing some changes to our heading structure on our site and some link labels. And I remember somebody saying, oh, you need to go meet with Brenda. Brenda's not going to be very happy. She's our SEO person. And I said, great, I look forward to it. And sure enough, I sat down with Brenda and I scheduled this 30-minute meeting. And I said, hey, we want to make sure that every page has an H1. And we want to make sure that all the headings after that go in descending order. We want to make sure that all the links don't just say learn more, but they're really more descriptive. We want to make sure that we make that our images have alt text that's meaningful. And all of that was stuff that she'd been arguing for and advocating for all along. But going for SEO rankings is very nebulous. And you make a change today and you hope to see an impact in 3, 6, or 9 months. With accessibility, you see that direct impact and you have a real user. We're not just talking about the Google bots. We're talking about a real user who's really going to be impacted by that change. So absolutely, they go hand in hand and don't contradict each other 9 times out of 10.
Excellent. Well, I think at this time, Corb, we've answered all questions that come through. Thank you so much for really very thorough covering of the WCAG 2.1 updates. I think to our audience on the line, we will follow up after today's presentation with an access to recording. Thanks again, Corb. Any final thought you'd like to leave us on?
You know, I think the main thing is in all the times that I've been out there trying to advocate for accessibility, so much of the work has started, and it feels sometimes like it stalls when it comes to creating empathy. You feel like I'm creating all of this awareness, but every time I go to advocate for something, I have to create that awareness again. And I think it's one of the greatest things about working in accessibility is that we can always point to a user and a different user and the different needs that somebody has. And again, it's not about pleasing a robot. It's not about pleasing compliance. It's about truly helping someone. And so the more that you can build empathy in the organization, the easier it is to get budget and headcount and to get developers to make changes and designers to be willing to adapt what they've drawn up, because it all comes down to that user. And so in so many ways, you're doing the right thing, even though it feels sometimes like you're pushing a boulder uphill and just constantly falling backwards. When you reach those milestones, it feels good for yourself, but more importantly, it's something that your users truly appreciate.
Excellent. It's a powerful statement and an excellent way to end the presentation. Thank you so much, Corb, and thank you to everyone for joining us today on behalf of SilverTech. Thank you so much.